broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is Wilmsfront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of Wilmsfront on this Wednesday, the 16th of December, 2020. We are live on the Wilmsfront YouTube and DLive channels, and also back on tonight the YouTube Enhanced Software Entropy, where throughout the night you can ask myself or my guests questions or also send through super chats. It is 7 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria. Thankfully, it is still shaping up here to be the perfect summer, given what we Australians went through over the last 12 months. There was the Black Summer bushfires across the southeast of Australia last summer. And then, of course, the lockdowns associated with the coronavirus pandemic beginning in March. This being an Australian summer, there have been some minor grass fires, but no homes or lives threatened at this stage. Wild weather has been hitting the northern coast of New South Wales and areas of the Gold Coast and southeast Queensland, resulting in flash flooding, including the new celebrity haven of Byron Bay. But locals, they know that it's a flash flooded prone area, and so have taken appropriate precautions, and they're getting ready for the cleanup job now. But obviously, compared to this time last summer when we had Sydney and Melbourne covered in a thick bushfire smoke for days, it's certainly the skies are much clearer at the moment. Here in Melbourne, the summer weather has been quite tropical, which has been to my liking. Warm, sunny days and the occasional summer rainfalls. That sort of goes in weekly cycles, I find. There has now been 47 days without COVID community transmission in Victoria, with only 7 cases in hotel quarantine so far, after 9 days of Victoria resuming receiving Australians returning from overseas. Over in the US, Joe Biden is now officially president-elect after the members of the Electoral College met from all 50 states plus the District of Columbia on Monday to cast their votes for president and vice president. The vote totals mirrored each state's certified election result, with the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris ticket receiving 306 votes, to the Donald Trump-Mike Pence ticket receiving 232 votes. The final step in the presidential election process is for the new Congress to certify the Electoral College results on January 6th. The Supreme Court has rejected both the Trump campaign's challenge to the electoral results and also the state of Texas lawsuit alleging irregularities in 4 battleground states. Trump supporters are still making their voices heard. There was another Million MAGA march in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, despite the fact I thought that they believed in staying at home to stop the spread and save lives. Antifa and Black Lives Matter counter-protested the march, but they got a bit scared by the Proud Boys and other patriots there, that they had to hide behind the DC police that they wished to defund. China has again this week upped its trade war against Australia, banning the import of Australian coal. This is on the same week as a database of 2 million CCP operatives was leaked online, showing how they have penetrated private corporations, education settings and levels of government across the Western world. While us Australians may be enjoying relative freedom this Christmas, we still have the COVID police surveillance state apparatus around us. Gathering limits still remain. QR codes are mandatory if you want to dine in or drink out anywhere, and Victoria still mandates masks in large retailers and public transport. We are still living under a state of emergency where the Premier can reimpose a lockdown at any moment. While many of us want to forget it, we should always remember the draconian measures us Melburnians were subjected to during our stage 4 lockdown, which lasted for 4 months, from July the 9th until November the 9th. Despite Victoria Police responding to anti-lockdown activism with brutality and dishing out massive fines, that was still not enough to deter the participants of the Melbourne Freedom Rallies, which began on Saturday, September the 5th at the Shrine of Remembrance, and have occurred most weekends ever since. There was another one last Saturday on the 5th at Fawkner Park in South Yarra, and there's another lot planned out in the Melbourne suburbs this Saturday. One of those who has participated in the Melbourne Freedom Day rallies is Harrison McLean. He is the co-founder of We, You, Me, a new social media project. His goals are listed as designing voluntary systems of interaction to empower humankind, accelerate technological improvement, and to protect the intrinsic rights of life, liberty, and security of property. Harrison, welcome to Wilmsfront.
That's good to be with you, Tim.
Now, the Victorian parliamentary year is wrapping up, and most Victorians are eager to enjoy some sense of normality. It's a perfect time for the Parliament or parliamentary committees, which are dominated by the Andrews Labor government and the government itself, to dump a whole lot of findings and information while we're all distracted rediscovering our surroundings without being asked why you're out. But it's certainly worth keeping everyone informed on what these dumps of information and inquiry findings reveal. And obviously we had the contact tracing inquiry findings, which, well, that it basically formalized in the form of a parliamentary report all the shortcomings with the COVID contact tracing systems, which is basically why we were in this state of lockdown, not because our health system couldn't cope, but because they couldn't trace cases. And it's been revealed that they used outdated systems for data entry, and that there was no. They were offered back in March the use of Salesforce CRM technology, which the DHS rejected. There's certainly a lot of, it sounded like a elite arrogance in the head of DHS that this is the way that we've always done things. We've got to keep it that way, and it's partly because of them that we were subjected to the second lockdown, the more draconian lockdown, which lasted for the longest and has been rolled out across the world. What do you make of this report?
I think that it's sort of it's an indictment on the Victorian government. I think that it finally sort of makes clear the sentiment that the Melbourne Freedom Movement has had for quite a while now, and that's that the Victorian response to the coronavirus was just not acceptable. That we need a sort of better level of response from the Victorian government that doesn't involve all of this, I guess, mass level lockdown of healthy people, and that the isolation measures be confined only to those who are sick and not isolating the healthy. I think it's about time that the Victorian government sort of moved away from lockdowns as a policy consideration. Around the world, we've seen sort of massive pushbacks against lockdowns. Locally here in Melbourne, the Melbourne Freedom Rally movement has been sort of making our voices heard in opposition to these policies for quite a while now. Starting from the 5th of September, at least for myself, some others were around before then. But at least from the 5th of September, we were sort of speaking out against lockdowns, speaking out against the failures of the Andrews government, and speaking out on behalf of the 6 million Victorians who have been sort of held hostage to coronavirus lockdowns for the better part of 5 or 6 months this year.
Now, where we're at on September 5, there was supposed to be only 9 more days of the stage 4 lockdown, because we had, the stage 3 lockdown on July the 9th, which then turned into a 6-week stage 4 lockdown beginning in August 2. And the next day after September 5th, which was Father's Day, that's when Dan released his roadmap out of lockdown. And well, from September 14th, we went 2 weeks of easing, as he called it, which I refer to as basically stage 3.9. And then we went to, after that, September 28th to October 19th, more easing. And then from October 19th to the 28th, further easing. And we'll sort of open from we were told lockdown ended on the 28th, but it didn't really, because the travel limit still applied. So yes, you could leave the house for any reason.
25-kilometer basis instead of 5 kilometers. Yeah.
It was only when the whole state was reopened and travel limits abolished on the 9th the 9th of November that I consider the lockdown truly ended. But I remember there was a lot of a pushback against people gathering to protest the lockdown on the 5th, saying, no, Dan will use it as an excuse to prolong the lockdown the next day, thinking that he was just going to let us all be free by September 14th, when they'd been leaked in advance, the roadmap out of lockdown, and we were basically lied to with that roadmap to claim that they claimed that it was a suppression strategy, but it's clearly, as we've seen now, an elimination strategy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There was a lot of, let's just say, heated debate within the movement at the time as to whether or not to proceed with the 5th of September rally. That was the stage at which I entered the movement, so I don't have full information of exactly what happened within the movement at that time. But when I joined, there was a lot of arguments back and forth internally as to whether people should go to the 5th or not. And the team that I was a part of ultimately decided that we were going to go on the 5th, and we made a very strong point of the matter. In fact, by starting, I guess, the branch of the movement called Melbourne Freedom Rally, we sort of made a contentious at the time point that when a rally date is announced, it does not get cancelled or postponed for this exact reason of people sort of finding little political reasons or little logistical reasons for why a rally date's not perfect. The answer is there's no such thing as a perfect rally date. What's most important is that you have sort of a strong level of consensus and stability on the date, so that you can have as many people being able to trust that they'll be surrounded by their fellow movement supporters on the day, because there is a very big issue in terms of making sure that people are able to be coordinated on a day, making sure everybody knows what the day is, having marketing materials going around that are out of date, which is another big issue. And in terms of like updating versions of graphics and things like that, we decided to make the design choice that we would not cancel or postpone rally dates to make sure that argument could be resolved going forward. And we think that was a pretty successful choice. So we've seen sort of the growth of at least our element of the movement significantly since the 5th of September. But yeah, we've gone from, I think, strength to strength in terms of initially not having as much support from our side of the fence to now being well over 1,500 people in our Telegram group, and a lot of internal community cohesion, which is very important, because it's very important to like be friends with the people that you're protesting with, and we think that we've done the best we can in terms of building a strong community around the freedom movement.
I remember around the 5th, the daily case count was at 80, and there were two elements to why people who didn't like the lockdown didn't want you to rally on the 5th. And obviously the first one was that Dan would use an excuse to prolong. Yeah, which I just went through before. They were already in the works.
Yeah, our side of the fence made a strong point of telling everyone that no matter whether we rally or not, he is still going to maintain the lockdown. Us not rallying would be essentially our consent as the people that we want to just follow the rules and just go along with it and just do what Dan says. It's always easy to just follow the rules and just go along with what the government says. But what takes a little bit more, I guess, determination is being able to draw a line in the sand and say, no. Today we're gonna stand up. We're gonna make our voices heard. We're gonna stand for freedom. We're gonna go on the 5th. And that was, I guess, the argument that we put around that if we were going to start playing politics with whether Dan would blame us for either there being more cases or not, our argument was that I think it would be better if we went, because we knew internally that there would not be a big uptick in cases.
Well, there wasn't. There was
not an uptick in cases.
Yeah.
There was not an uptick in any sort of hospitalization rate from the protests. The same as what we'd seen with the Black Lives Matter rally. Despite the difference of police treatment for the Black Lives Matter rally, what we didn't see afterwards was the media's projected increase in the number of cases. Because what we knew internally was that what our position was that the coronavirus was nowhere near as dangerous as people were making it out to be. That the media hype around the coronavirus was just absolutely exaggerated, overblown. There was massive levels of fraud involved in the testing, in the allocation of death certificates, and that if we were to rally on the 5th and there wouldn't be a sort of peak in cases after that day, that would prove our point 100 times more than avoiding the day and taking a little bit of political ire, which actually didn't occur anyway. We were barely even mentioned in terms of Dan's justification for continuing lockdown, which we knew was going to happen anyway.
He had a repeated mantra about all your rallies. He would say it's not smart, it's not safe, it's selfish, stupid, and unlawful. And Victoria Police wouldn't have to do all the brutal things that they did if people didn't protest.
Well, it's my view that protesting is a human right, and it's my view that freedom of movement is a constitutional right that's protected in Australia by federal legislation. So for Dan to use the state of disaster to essentially restrict people to the 5-kilometre radius outside their home is, in my view, one of the greatest violations of human rights to ever occur in Australia. There have definitely been other violations of human rights, but that one's definitely up there in terms of the size and the scale of the crime committed. And it was a crime. In my view, in the future, we will look back on this as an absolute failure of public policy and as the human rights violation that it was. That's my view. I hope that view is vindicated. And I think now that people have sort of been released, I guess, from the tighter grip of the lockdown, there's a bit more of a public understanding that lockdowns are not very effective to control what sort of this virus represents, which is the way I understand the coronavirus myself is 10% virus, 90% religion of fear. So there is a virus component to the coronavirus, but the virus component to the coronavirus is only about 10% of it. The other 90% is the surrounding complex of media fear mongering, political expediency, excuses to implement authoritarianism, excuses to implement government level corruption, excuses to print money and accelerate the debt, excuses to have a culture of submission pushed into the Australian psyche. And I guess above all else, excuses to move the ratchet of authoritarianism one click at a time towards a more totalitarian state at a local and international level.
Just in the last couple of minutes, your audio was broken up a bit and your camera's got a bit blurry. Just letting you know. But
should I?
Yeah, but the audience might have trouble. But
okay, I guess I'll repeat it. I'll sum it up essentially. Yeah, what I was saying was that the coronavirus is about 10%. It's 10% about the virus, 90% about the fear campaign, and the excuse to implement authoritarianism around the world. So, in my view, there is a new novel virus, but the impact of the virus is very small in comparison to the level of propagandizing of the worldwide population that's occurred in its name.
And in addition to Dan with his scolding of you, there was also Assistant Commissioner Luke Cornelius, also known as Chief Wiggum, with his.
That's what we called him when we were being nice.
Yes, that's the polite nickname for him.
I think that.
But he made his splash by calling you all the tinfoil hat brigade, and then of course he defended all the incitement, arrests, and charges, including the handcuffing of
that was shocking.
Zoe Bueller, and saying on the 5th, we've got all these operations. We'll meet you at the train stations. Your feet won't even hit the ground. Really ratcheting up the fear, which would have deterred people as well. And we saw on the day, well, I've seen Victoria Police in that full riot gear before, where they've got basically the thick armor padding. But they got even more. Their outfits got even more. You would say armored the next weekend at the Queen Vic Market, which was on the 13th, where they
were definitely the most militarized ones we saw.
And
they had on the Queen Victoria Market event, they had a lot of shields. They're all in shields in sort of full. Full port officer armor, so that was a sight to behold. I personally couldn't make the Queen Victoria Market event, but the people there told me that was probably the most violent the police were to date at that day. That was a major ratchet up in the sort of level of force that was used.
And then the next weekend was you call it the chase around Elwood Beach. That was during the first weekend of easing, where you were allowed out for 2 hours of either exercise or recreation. So the Victoria Police were all chasing after you around Elwood Beach because you were engaged in political activism, but there were heaps of people around sunbaking on the beach or whatever. They weren't bothered about them. It seemed because you were making a political statement against the lockdown that they wanted to target you.
That's right. So we saw across this entire time that not only in Australia but internationally, every single coronavirus restriction has been selectively enforced because it's physically impossible to enforce it 100% of the time. In fact, I would argue it's barely even economically possible to enforce it any more than about 1% of the time. But the 1% of the time that they do choose to enforce coronavirus restrictions with police officers just happen to be all of the times that people that are against the government in power happen to be making political statements. It's a very convenient way of sort of shutting down any event that the government doesn't like. You can apply it to anything. Any business you don't like is not distancing enough. Any protest you don't like is not distancing enough. Any sort of person that doesn't wear a mask is a danger to society, unless, of course, that person is a member of the same government that you're in. So when the government does it, it's a pretty clear signal that the laws do not apply equally to everyone.
And the two big freedom days before we were fully open on the 9th there was the grand final eve protest, which started at the Shrine, then went up Swanston Street and ended up at Hungry Jack's on King's Way, and
petrol station. And what we were attempting to do is reach Parliament House. Unfortunately, the crowd that we were in couldn't make it to Parliament House because at every attempt to sort of cross the river, we were a bit blocked off by the police. So we couldn't actually make it to Parliament House, but that didn't stop us from trying.
Although when you did make it to Parliament House on the Melbourne Cup Day protest, that's when the police were able to, because it is an enclosed, able to kettle you all and pick you out one by one to process and fine you all. So they kept some of you in for 2 to 3 hours because obviously there's not enough officers to pick hundreds at you at once
Yeah, it was over
and
3 hours
put you down for processing. But the outrageous thing about that day is the police offered no explanations. They just processed you and that was it.
That's right. So on that day, it was well over 3 hours from start to finish. We had some great speeches from some of our people at the start of the day. But unfortunately, we were fairly interrupted. There were more speeches to come, but we had to sort of chop them off because we realized that we were being surrounded. So in our sort of attempt to get the crowd moving to the location we were planning to move to, we got blocked off from every side. They had us fairly well surrounded within the first 30 minutes or so. And yeah, we were not able to leave the vicinity of the Parliament House. We got very split up into lots of different groups. There were some people stuck outside the circle. I happened to be stuck inside the circle. And the destination that we were planning to do is sort of just like march down Burke Street. We weren't able to do that. So there are some that say, oh, you shouldn't sit still, you'll get kettled. That day we were not planning to sit still. They had us surrounded well before we were ready to move.
Well, because Parliament House, Spring Street, it's in the CBD. Obviously, it's much easier for them to close off the roads. While it's harder for them to do that, say at the Shrine, an open place like that, because you can just go into different grass directions and that. Was there some reflection about that? Obviously, there's the way that the police treated you that day was appalling, but was there some reflection there? Maybe we could have planned that better.
There was definitely some reflection to be had after the Parliament House protest. We realised that our choice of location was going to be a very important factor for the success or failure of the protest. So the success that we had was getting that many people that close to the Parliament House, because our previous rally had attempted to get to the Parliament House. So the fact that we even got there in that many numbers, despite the fact that we were kettled, I'd still chalk that up to a success. Where we sort of learn from that is that we need to be able to start the event and get everything up and running fairly quickly and be ready to move with everybody organized and knowing sort of where they're going to be moving to. And to be a bit less focused on the optics of the location and more focused on the logistics of the location, because obviously the optics of Parliament House sends a fairly strong message of opposition to the government. But obviously the logistical ability to get out of there once we're there is quite limited. So I guess to answer your original question, there was another element that was very important to recognize that some people who weren't there may not understand. And that's it. At the 23rd of October, the protest at the Shrine, the evening before Cup Day, there was actually an attempt to kettle us.
Grand final day.
There was an attempt to kettle us there as well at the Shrine, but the Victoria Police made a very different operational decision, and that was to open up a gap to actually let us all out of the circle. So we were expecting for something like that to happen again at Parliament House, but it never did. My view of why that was done is because at the Shrine, there was simply too many of us to process, whereas at Parliament House, they were able to kind of chop block us at a few of the different road adjoinement bits. So it would have been much easier to break us up, whereas at the Shrine, it was one big mass of people harder to break up.
And as the Victoria Police have admitted today, Shane Patton, he has been the Victorian Police Commissioner and testifying before the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, has said, the reason we didn't stop Black Lives Matter is because there was 10,000 too many and we feared a riot, which basically, I guess, shows that if you have more numbers, then the police make different decisions. And obviously they're a lot more scared of the Antifa Black Lives Matter left because of their propensity for violence.
Yeah, they're much more prone to violence. The entire time of the Melbourne Freedom Movement, we've been as non-violent as we possibly could be. That has not been any part of our strategy to engage in any kind of violence. the one element of small violence that did occur was actually done by an individual that was dressed in black bloc and was clearly carrying what looked like, I think it was a Black Lives Matter flag or an Antifa flag or something like that.
Yes, that was at the
23rd
grand final eve one, where struck the police horse, which that guy's a grub for doing that.
He was in fact a grub. I can confirm that. And the movement obviously did not support him. No one knew who he was, and he does not obviously represent what we're standing for, which is a non-violent resistance movement against lockdowns and against the disastrous public policy failure that has been the Victorian response to the coronavirus.
It sounds like, from the information that is coming out through these close to Christmas dumps, is this was the Andrews government was told health system was in disrepair before COVID-19 struck. And you remember right back in March, Dan Andrews, he set the tone that this was not a public health response, it was a police state response. He's like, stay at home means this, otherwise Victoria Police are going to enforce this. And you recall that we had, during our first stage 3 lockdown, the most draconian rules of any state, including banning golf and fishing. There's been no COVID outbreaks trace to that. And there was even, for a day, they tried to ban intimate partners who lived apart from seeing each other. And of course, Victoria was the last state to reopen after that first national lockdown. And even then, when it was after Mother's Day. I think we reopened on the Wednesday, the 14th of May. All the pubs, cafes, and restaurants were still takeaway, but the permitted reasons to leave the house were extended to see friends and family. So still technically under stay-at-home orders. But now looking back, it's because they knew that they couldn't handle tracking any outbreak, and so their only response was to basically just scare the people into submission, either through the virus or the threat of fines, because Victoria has issued the most fines and had the highest monetary fines, 1,652 for breach of the chief health officer's directions. There was a $200 mask fine, and then there was the $4,957 fine, which first was for breaching self-isolation if you test positive, but then was for an unauthorized gathering, which, again, the fact that the Andrews government chose a police state response and we had a second wave shows that, because lockdowns, that you need a police state to enforce lockdowns, that clearly it didn't stop the second wave.
Lockdowns are sort of a term that originates in, I guess, prison culture. When you have a prison riot, you engage in lockdown in a prison. So Daniel Andrews treated the state of Victoria as a prison for over 6 months. And it's my view that Victorians should never be subjected to anything like that again. And the fact that we were represents a dire misunderstanding of the resolve of Victorians to sort of protect the freedoms of the people that are around us. So some people, maybe they're okay with being inside for sort of months and months on end. But a lot of us definitely aren't. A lot of small businesses aren't. A lot of the victims of mental health issues, of suicide, of financial distress, of relationship distress, of a lot of other illnesses that were sort of pushed to the wayside to make way for the almighty media-driven fear campaign of coronavirus. Those are the real victims of lockdown. The body count of the Victorian lockdown will be measured in the months and years to come. But it's my view that it'll make the body count due to the coronavirus pale in comparison.
And you briefly touched on it before about the death certificates of COVID victims. A lot of them died, and this was admitted by our Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, died with COVID, not exclusively from COVID. And, well, the overwhelming majority of the deaths came from aged care outbreaks, which, again, the Victorian government failed to quarantine the sick and the vulnerable, but lock down the healthy. Totally perverse lockdown.
Oh yeah, it's perverse incentives from the government side, because the more they do lockdowns, the more they're able to create what I tend to call a captive audience. With the Andrews Labor voting base, I find that they tend to be wanting protection. They want someone strong to protect them from some external fear, some boogeyman. Not all of them, but a lot of them are very willing to sort of sacrifice freedoms in exchange for the welfare increases, the job seeker payments, the sort of, for some people, what was in effect a paid vacation. That was something that was enticing and sort of tempting for some people to just go along with it and collect the money and just be very, very quiet about it while they got to stay at home and keep getting paid. But I was one of the millions of Victorians who worked the entire time through. I did not get a paid vacation. I worked the entire time through my sort of retail job that I do part time, and there was no marginal benefit to me, at least, for being locked down and continuing to work, because for the jobs that matter to keep the economy open, they never stopped working. There was no reprieve for a lot of Victorians who worked through the entire thing, and it's my view that it gave the government a very big excuse to go into a lot of debt, to borrow a lot of money, to spend a lot of money, to buy a lot of votes, and to engage in the kind of socialist economic policies that I'm sure they would like to be able to do under regular circumstances. But the coronavirus lockdown certainly gives them a very greased wheel in terms of being able to borrow and spend large amounts of taxpayers' money without too much public pushback. And we've seen around the world, specifically in America, that there's been a massive increase in national debt, in the public debt of the Victorian state, such to the extent that we've gone into, I think we've lost a credit rating. We've gone to AA instead of AAA. So there's been a lot of issues that have sort of been caused by the political misincentives to push and prolong lockdowns, the media misincentives to push and prolong lockdowns, and certainly the medical misincentives to produce and prolong lockdowns in terms of the money that stands to be made off of a mandatory vaccination program without any liability for the companies that make the vaccines.
All the coronavirus support programs, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, all the support funds, the coronavirus isolation payments, they've just been, where the state and federal whacked on the credit card. And in terms of economic rebuilding, the Andrews state budget is basically building a bigger government. There's hardly anything to relieve struggling small business incentives, anything like that. The only thing I can think of is, well, those $200 travel vouchers, which again are on the credit card, and was it the website crashed last Friday, which it's very common for government websites to crash.
Oh, yeah. They're built on a very low bidding contract. Yes,
but again, it goes to, as you said, the socialist leanings of the Andrews Labor government, and to them, obviously, Build Back Better means government building things, and they've revealed their socialist public housing package, and definitely the Andrews government sees the economic rebuilding to be led by the state rather than the private sector.
Yeah, that's we're seeing around the world sort of a mantra forming around what is commonly called the Great Reset, which has a tagline, Build Back Better, which we've seen politicians parroting around the world. And the Great Reset's sort of an up and rising program from the World Economic Forum. Some of your viewers might be familiar with it, but if they're not, it's a very interesting read to sort of see the level of top corporations, top government agencies, top non-governmental organizations. It's an unholy union of large corporations, government, sort of left-leaning governments, and international NGOs to create a top-down state capitalist system that is modeled highly on the Chinese communist model, which is essentially using the power of the state to take over companies to model what's called inclusive capitalism, which is essentially a rose-colored goggle look at what the Chinese Communist Party uses as a state capitalist model, where the government has full control over corporations. They can take over boards, they can appoint members, they can essentially nationalize any corporation at will, remove directors, give a wide range of instructions to companies, and have very little in the way of recourse from the owners of the companies, in the way of recourse from the employees of the companies. And if you have a hybrid model of government spending and government control, plus the free market used in a limited sense to deploy the execution strategy of that, you have something that has the control system of communism with the effectiveness of free market capitalism rolled into one sort of system of top-down authoritarianism.
Which is basically traditional fascism.
Yeah. Well, not traditional fascism. There's been a lot of changes specifically around the empowerment of the weaving of technology into it. So in China, some of your viewers might be aware that they have a social credit score. And there's been a lot of discussion, at least at the sort of early stage to mid-stage level, of rolling this out internationally. There are a lot of corporations that would have a vested interest in doing that. There's a lot of government people that would have a vested interest in doing that, and essentially creating a Chinese state capitalist model for the West to proceed towards, which puts the government at the center of the economy and makes everyone else in the economy a supplicant to the government.
Well, the rest of the world, and particularly Victoria, followed the Wuhan lockdown model, because apparently the Wuhan lockdown eliminated the virus from Wuhan, because they had that massive pool party with no masks or social distancing. And it was interesting in the Chip Legrand features in the Age recently. There was one doctor who they interviewed that perhaps nobody would have ever tried lockdowns if Wuhan had never done it.
That's right. Yeah. So the lockdown strategy was not in common parlance in the medical sphere. It was heavily pushed and essentially propagandized by the Chinese Communist Party to be the model of solving the virus under a very, very strong level of pressure in terms of time and political capital. Governments were, if you recall, in the early days, very eager to show that they were tough on the virus, and there was a sort of a competitiveness between the states to have the toughest restrictions, the toughest lockdowns, and politicians were measuring their likelihood of being re-elected, just taking the numbers of cases.
Well, the media were egging them on as well.
Oh,
7 and 9, the worst offenders, and tabloid newspapers as well. Basically, because nobody's watching them anymore, and so of course, what sells? Fear. This new killer virus that we don't know much about because it was born in communist China, and they deliberately spit out fake news to perpetuate the panic buying and all that sort of stuff, and new ways that COVID can be transmitted through this means and all this and that. Basically, pandemic porn.
Yep, that's exactly what it was. It was the dying gasp of the traditional. I call them legacy media. I don't call them mainstream media anymore. Obviously, mainstream media has got a bit of a nice ring to it, but they're really the legacy media. In many ways, the internet is the new sort of mainstream media. People use it to get their news all the time. I myself don't even watch that much legacy media in the first place, but where it does still have an impact is with older voters and with politicians, because I guess it's hard for them to sort of keep up with the new formats of media, whether it be YouTube, whether it be discussions through Facebook, internet websites that don't have mainstream adoption, that are sort of the independent media base. But they have seen their business models in decay for years. They've seen their advertising revenue plummet in response to the rise of social media, where there's a much more compelling advertising product to be delivered to companies, as opposed to sort of static advertising in newspapers and in TV ad spots. The level of I guess advertiser scrutiny and targeting that you can do to reach the specific target audience you want is something that a newspaper or a TV station can never compete with. They've essentially been outclassed in the delivery of their product, which is advertising. Despite what a lot of people think, the product of a TV station is not to make the news. It's not to do journalism. It's not to make entertaining TV shows. When you watch TV, you are the product, and the product is advertising. And they've been outcompeted on the product of advertising for the last 10 years by social media.
Yeah, Facebook and Twitter operate in the same ways that traditional television and print have. In regard to who still watches television, you're right that it's older people, and they have bought the pandemic porn, which is why you're seeing, for example, in the UK, all these old people just open their arms to the new vaccine, and so, oh yes, this is definitely the ticket back to normal. And they've been willing for the past 8 months to live their final years in complete isolation, which loneliness is a big killer of the elderly. We've seen during the lockdown a lot of people die in aged care nursing just from loneliness, because they've been isolated, not separated from loved ones. That's also driven a lot of young people to mental illness, eating disorders, suicides during this time as well. The after waves of this lockdown, it's only just begun.
Oh yeah, the effects of this will last for decades. There have been sort of 3 very, very large effects that will play out, in my view, over the next sort of 10 plus years. Number one is that the internet has now become the native network effect of the world. Before coronavirus, there was a high value of network effect built into physical locations. Like living in a city would command a premium because you had the network effect of living near other people, of being near where all the employment opportunities were, being near where all the shops were. There was a value in the place where you lived, in terms of being able to have a shorter distance to travel to work. What the coronavirus has effectively done is it has melted away the network effect value of locations to a large extent. It's essentially democratized the value of a place from a business perspective heavily. So it's much more available to do remote working. It's much less necessary to have a physical location to do business, because obviously a lot of the food sort of businesses pivoted to being a delivery model or having a pickup only model. A lot of the business innovations that we saw to deal with the lockdown are going to be carried over as business practices, because they are simply more efficient and more cost effective from a business perspective. So a lot of the efficiency gains of cleaning out an office, of not having thousands of people commute to work every day, the reduction in traffic that we saw, at least on arterial roads, I don't think that we'll... There are a lot of things that could potentially come out that are positive, and I think one of those things is the shift away from highly dense network effect as a location. Places like Silicon Valley have largely been supplanted as places to do business. There's a big move to sort of move away from densely populated, expensive cities like New York, San Francisco. Eventually, Melbourne, I think, will be a victim of this the same. I guess the second big change is going to be the push to remote work as a default model. and as a first-class option for any kind of digital employment. So the concept of having a very large office filled with administrative workers, I think that's going to. It was already fading away. There was already a big push within the tech industry to move towards remote working as an option. But now that it is an expectation, you'll see the network effect of companies move away from the office as a place where people work and more towards home, even after the lockdown has gone through, because ultimately working from home is a very sort of big improvement to flexibility of lifestyles. It allows people to sort of move away from expensive cities and have sort of cheaper accommodation because they don't need to live in a very small apartment because they need to live close to a city. And the last sort of change that we've seen in the coronavirus is the government's willingness to very clearly exaggerate the importance of emergencies to deliver monetary policy objectives. So that's a lot to unpack there, but essentially the government has the ability now, from now on, to manufacture emergencies, any kind of new virus. They've set themselves the precedent that if any new virus emerges, there is a very large majority of the population that will be willing to accept any government edict as long as they are paid money to be quiet. And that's a very bad precedent to set. It's a very dangerous precedent to set. And it's very important that we acknowledge that that precedent has been set and it needs to be unset very soon.
Sir, you keep talking.
Yeah, I'll let you cough that up. I guess the issue that we've seen with monetary policy changes, and it's gone to a very stimulus-driven approach of just pay people money and it makes all the problems go away. The issue with that is that it very clearly sort of leads into what's called modern monetary theory. Some of the viewers might be familiar with modern monetary theory. Is that something that you've explained to your viewers before?
Refresh our audience.
Yeah.
Sorry, the reason why I coughed there was because Coke went down the wrong way. I should probably, according to Dan, get a COVID test now since I had
need to get a COVID test. Especially if that Coke was positive, which it can be.
Oh, yes, because that Austrian lawmaker had the COVID test positive. So yes, definitely need to get. It's given me COVID. I think the Coke. This Coke.
Yeah. Classic. Yeah. So modern monetary theory is essentially the idea that the government and by extension the central bank, on behalf of the government, can print an unlimited amount of money and effectively distribute it to whoever the central bank wants to distribute it to. As a supplanting mechanism to budgetary policy. So in budgetary policy, you have the government borrowing money and going into debt to basically spend for things. With modern monetary theory, the central bank directly prints money and spends it themselves on things that would normally be reserved for the government, whether that's things like infrastructure, welfare payments, healthcare payments, the cancellation of loans, and the model of managing inflation in a currency moves away from interest rates, which is what it's been for the last several decades, since about the 1971 to be exact, when we moved to fully fiat currency in the US dollar. Since 1971, the model for controlling inflation has been use interest rates to sort of rein in borrowing and rein in spending on against debt. But now we've sort of greased the skids for a move to modern monetary theory as a monetary strategy, which posits that money can be printed ad infinitum, that monetary debt is not relevant, and that the mechanism for maintaining inflation resistance or maintaining stability of prices should not be interest rates. In fact, it should be using taxes. So you essentially move away from the interest rate model of managing inflation, you move to a taxation base. So what I think we'll see in the next few years is significant inflation from a lot of this printing of money, and the government will have to go to some very interesting measures to rein it in, because they have essentially set interest rates to zero for a very long period of time, and to maintain the debt bubble, they'll need to enable people to borrow in new and ever growing ways. Otherwise, the sort of the fiat currency paradigm ceases to exist. So they've gone through an S-curve stage. They've reached the limits of what they can do in terms of inflationary growth under the current monetary paradigm. And they're eager to move to modern monetary theory so that they can dispel the notion of the government having to actually pay back their debt.
Well, we saw in 2020 a somewhat a war on cash, because apparently cash, the coronavirus could be transmitted through cash, even though there was never any proof of that. But it was perfectly okay for you.
They've been trying to get rid of cash for a very long time for quite a few reasons. So number one is for the financial privacy that cash offers. That one's fairly straightforward. But the other two issues that cash presents to the proponents of modern monetary theory is that it has a 0% interest rate, because you can't deduct through negative interest rates a $20 note that is in your wallet. Unfortunately, negative interest rates don't flow through the air. They have to flow through a digital mechanism. So the third thing that they want to do is have negative interest rates on money, so that people are essentially able to borrow money and be paid for it, and have interest charged on their savings to essentially create a perpetually diminishing value of all saving currency. So the combination of the privacy issues, the ability for people to avoid negative interest rates, and then the third sort of major thing is the financial exclusion that cash protects you from. When you have digital currency or centralized fiat digital currency as the primary payment mechanism, it's very difficult to sort of kick people off it and to lock people out of their accounts. So to make the financial system a law enforcement mechanism that is outside of the realms of due process, as we've seen with sort of PayPal being a very high pressure point, credit card companies kicking people off, expect that to flow on to bank accounts, where people will have their bank accounts shut down.
It's already happened. Australian patriot Blair Cottrell had his bank account closed last year. So did a number of other Australian patriots, and it's happened to members of the patriot movement in the UK, such as Mark Collett.
I think it's reasonable to expect that the same level of censorship that we've seen from centralized social media networks will also occur in ever-growing numbers on centralized payment networks. Whenever you have a centralization of power, you have the ability to very easily and cheaply exclude people from it, whether it's to ban people from using Twitter or ban people from having Facebook groups. The next step in sort of the use the corporate mechanisms of power to unperson you, the next step in that is widespread losses of people's bank accounts if they're dissidents from the mainstream narrative. That's already happening with some people, but I expect that trend to sort of accelerate.
And there's even been calls for people's credit card payment patterns to be used for contact tracing purposes. And this is the other concern going forward with this ongoing surveillance for contact tracing purposes. And Australia is being a global leader with that, with pretty much all state and territories now mandating QR check-in codes. So yeah, you can dine out or have a drink now, but yeah, they want you to check in by registering it. And we're already seeing privacy breaches with that, with a lot of outlets sending people unsolicited spam. So already your personal information from that is being passed around. If
it's an email list, it's an email list building growth hack is what that is. The other thing that's being added in is the phone number verification. So some people sort of noticed that it was possible to maybe not put the accurate phone number into some of the QR code early implementations. But now what I've seen some of them doing is essentially testing the phone number by having a text confirmation screen. Unfortunately, what that does do is it allows the business to send you all sorts of text messages. It basically automatically signs everybody up for the it could potentially, not that every business is doing this, but they could use that phone number or that email address for marketing. and eventually that database could be breached if the business's information is breached.
This is where I actually didn't mind Dan saying about signing in to restaurants or that pen and papers fine for privacy reason. And it was ironically the anti-lockdown News Corp journalists was like, how can you not mandate this QR surveillance system, which showed that just how weak they were on ongoing human rights. But obviously, we're seeing, as I mentioned before, the vaccine rolled out in the northern hemisphere as they go through their winter flu virus season. I'm glad our government is basically seeing how the vaccine works out up there, and they
got a test run of the Melbourne model of a hard lockdown. We're about to see their test run of what a vaccine rollout looks like. So kind of we're getting an opportunity to test bits and pieces of the mechanism on certain cities first, and then in response to those things, I think they'll adjust the way that they roll them out.
In a sign that, well, they're called anti-vaxxers, their vaccine choice activists are having an influence on politicians. We're seeing not just our government, but governments around the world backing down from mandatory or coerced vaccines through, when it comes to at least the coronavirus vaccine, and particularly backing away from the COVID passport. But definitely from the major corporations, they're a lot of news articles are flowing through that they want to mandate their employees to have it, and that's sort of where it's sort of that mandatory by stealth.
Yeah, that's the classic Chinese Communist Party state capitalist model of using the corporations as the enforcement mechanism of overly authoritarian edicts, because while it may not be possible to enforce authoritarian laws 100% of the time using the apparatus of the state, it's a lot more efficient to enforce totalitarianism through corporate policy, because corporations are very large sitting targets, and they essentially have to comply with all the rules of the government. Otherwise, they can be very simply shut down, because every corporation exists under the good grace of the government that manages their registration and everything like that. So it's very difficult for a corporation to have policies that violate laws, despite it being a lot easier for individual dissidents to avoid some of the more over-the-top restrictions. It's very difficult for a company to be able to push back against these things. That's why they'll be using, in my view, a corporate enforcement model where it won't technically be mandatory to get the vaccine, but they will pressure companies with the threat of legal liability. If their employees get the coronavirus, they'll pressure them with threat of liability if customers get it. And by stealth of corporate regulation, they will make it highly unprofitable to be able to let people live their lives without a vaccine, unless, of course, the people that make up the customer base of Australia collectively say that that's not acceptable, that we're willing to leave the jobs of those companies. It's my view that everyone in the pro-vaccine choice movement should be willing, in at least an academic sense for now, but eventually in a very real sense, to migrate their employment to a company that does not support mandatory vaccines for customers and employees. And if they're not willing to do that, then that's something that will become an issue. Eventually, there will be a choice between keeping your establishment job and being able to live your life without being subjected to the arbitrary forced vaccination of the medical establishment.
There are a few MPs. One of them is George Christensen, who actually wants the federal government to legislate to ban companies like Qantas having in its terms and conditions certain vaccinations before traveling. It's certainly been, obviously that's still a state intervention, but I don't know if you've thought about this. I've hypothesized about the reverse coronavirus dictator, where you just ban private businesses from having all of these COVID restrictions on themselves. For example, even though masks are no longer mandatory in smaller retail settings, in post offices, banks, pharmacies, and in hospitality, there's still, and takeaway as well, there's still those signs up: no mask, no entry.
Yeah.
Even though the masks now have literally no benefit at all.
Oh no, they now that we've seen that we're down to effectively 0 cases for many days now, maybe with a few little hiccups here and there, but there is essentially, in an operational sense, there is virtually no risk of getting the coronavirus in Victoria at this time. While many people have died from it, the risk of death, if people do get it, is substantially lower than the risk of death of a variety of other illnesses that should be more concerning to the average person. Like cancer, heart disease, the things that actually kill lots of people, and not the things that the media would like to hype up. The real reasons people die are a lot more boring and a lot more methodical than the media would like to have you believe. But the real issue is that people need to sort of take responsibility for their own health, their own bodies, be willing to do their own research, their own due diligence, to sort of dig into at least some surface level of the data, to be able to see when the government makes mistakes, to acknowledge that the government makes mistakes, and to be able to raise your voice in a corrective tone when they do make mistakes, because governments do make mistakes, and it's up to the people to sort of lead the charge to wrangle in the size and scope of the government. Because if we don't sort of show initiative and we don't speak truth to power, there will be only the voice of the media remaining in the room. There was a lot of sort of online censorship. There was a lot of shutting down of dissenting views that we saw both locally and internationally. And it's important that people have ways to sort of reach large audiences, even when the things that they have to say are controversial, that may not be popular with the establishment, and certainly may not be within the good graces of the Overton window.
Now, obviously, we've gone through the Victorian police state response, where Victoria issued the most fines to people close to 40,000, which equals about 30 million. Police Commissioner Shane Patton has told today that only a fraction of the fines have been fully paid. So 2,800 have been paid in full, while nearly 5,000 have been withdrawn or cancelled. And then there's also the more contentious one is the ones issued to those under 18s, basically setting before they're even 18 a debt trap. And how many fines have you received?
I've received 7 fines for the activism that I've done against the Victorian lockdowns, and I won't be paying any of those. I'll be contesting them all in court.
So say, hypothetically, all the outstanding fines get challenged in court, which means that the police then send you a letter saying that you'll receive a summons soon with withdrawing this fine. The police informant has to prepare a brief, and that's going to clog the justice system up quite substantially. And don't forget that real criminals, they've been out committing violence, burglaries. There's still been rape and murder going on, unfortunately. Who would have known that criminals don't obey lockdowns? But
they certainly don't.
I know
the other issue is that it's made ordinary, sort of otherwise law-abiding people into de facto criminals for simply wanting the right to leave their house to sort of demonstrate their disposition with the government's policies. And the people that I've seen in the movement have been some of the nicest, friendliest, most fun-loving, genuine people that I've met in my time, and none of these people would be criminals anywhere near outside of this situation that we've all been put in. So it's brought out the bravery in a lot of people, and I think some of the things that I'm most proud of in the work that I've done so far to sort of help grow this movement is to unify people behind a message of freedom, where previously in Victoria there was a lot of sort of disorganization and a lot of apathy. This has been a galvanizing moment for everybody to sort of take a step back and realize that it's time to sort of get organized, to get proactive, and to start sort of speaking up against these things.
Well, when people are put under house arrest, the government shuts them out of their jobs or businesses, that sort of apathy disappears. I'm sure you've met Rukshan Fernando, the real Rukshan, with his
Real
with
Rukshan
his
is fantastic. Shout out to the real Rukshan. Anyone who's not subscribed to him now, definitely take a check out of that guy.
Well, it was the government shutting down his wedding business that turned him into an activist, because he was just living an ordinary, you would say, rationally ignorant political life, because he was just able to operate his business, go around freely, and then all of a sudden in 2020 his life has been turned upside down. And I can think nothing better for him to do than make all these anti-government, anti-totalitarian videos to get back at them for shutting down his business.
Yeah, he's been a fantastic videographer for the movement. Without his fantastic work, we would have a lot less videography to show of the events that we've done so far. So definitely shout out to Real Rukshan. Thank you for all you've been doing. In the same tone to Marty Fokker as well. Marty has been a great videographer of the events we've done so far. So it's really good to have so many good people with significant online presences that are able to video the things we do. Same goes to Monica Smith and Reignite Democracy Australia. There have been a lot of people who have really stepped up to the plate in terms of people that weren't traditionally activist or political in any way, shape, or form. I guess I was a little bit more politically leaning before this, as sort of my involvement in the cryptocurrency sphere led me to be a bit more libertarian leaning. But some people that were just living normal lives have had to contend with the fact that they'll need to be a lot more active in the political process than maybe they first realized.
We've got a super chat on Entropy from Andrew McGuinness. He sent through $3 Australian dollars. He's been a regular super chatter in the past. So thanks, Andrew. He said all governments and government departments in the land known as Australia are corporations with Australian business numbers or ABNs. I'm sure you've come across
definitely come across that line of argument before. I guess while I agree that many of the companies can be found on ABN registers, they certainly don't act like private companies. They do act like government agencies that are willing to use force to advance their economic and political interests. So I think that we need to move away from this argument that government departments are corporations as an attack sort of strategy, and instead go more towards governments should use less force and be more voluntary, and in fact act more like corporations and less like totalitarian states. Obviously, that's more of a libertarian perspective on the matter. I wish the government was more like a corporation where you could voluntarily choose to not engage with it or interact with it. But there's a limited utility in the pointing out of the fact that some departments do have ABN numbers, specifically like the police, Fines Victoria. There are elements of the government that are privatized, but they certainly don't act like private companies in the way that they should. If they were acting as private companies.
Yeah. Well, what's the libertarian analogy? If governments were private corporations, then they'd be more like organized crime.
Yeah. So the common argument that is made against libertarians is won't the warlords take over? If you remove the government, the warlords would just take over. Imagine that. Imagine you removed all the government, and then a warlord took over. And here's what the warlord says: the warlord says everyone has to pay 30% of their income to me, or else you go to jail. The warlord says people have to fight for me in an army. They have to go overseas and they have to kill people. They have to drone strike people. They have to follow all of the dictates that I make. They have to always agree with the policy statements that I make to a certain extent. Otherwise, they'll be attacked in the media. They'll be attacked by the people that I pay and work with. If anybody breaks any of these minute rules, if they smoke the wrong plant, if they go a few kilometers over the speed limit, they'll be subjected to the wrath of my enforcers of the warlord, where they'll drive cars around the road and enforce the policies of the warlord upon the entire population. And if you protest against the warlord, they'll use capsicum spray and they'll surround you and give you fines and all that stuff. And then you sort of tend to realize that what we call the government is really a big organized warlord wearing a suit. So the argument that the warlords will just take over is kind of the warlords have already taken over. They just have very nice public relations campaigns.
Well, we've seen basically Australia run during 2020 by 8 different warlords and the state and territory leaders because they've all done their own thing with regards to dealing with COVID and the restrictions. Well, the only state that has actually done a suppression strategy, meaning contain the virus without locking down the economy, is New South Wales. There's been an outbreak today traced to a airport transportation person, which stands at 3 active cases. They're not going to shut down the state because of that, but other states might put up their borders. But this is the thing where we're all still living under varying state of emergencies wherever we are in Australia. Thankfully, in Victoria, we are no longer living under the state of disaster, which allowed the most draconian abuse of human rights. But we can still be sent into lockdown, restricted at any moment, as we saw during South Australia's circuit breaker lockdown. And was that public gathering limits in Victoria are still at 100. There's still no mention of public protests in the Chief Health Officer's directions. I think we can guess because Dan doesn't like people protesting against him, which is why there's been this talk about this permit system to protest.
Yeah, so I've heard a bit about this being discussed in the early stages. There has been, I think, one MP, Donoghue, or something to that extent.
Yeah, Edward O'Donoghue.
That's the one, Edward O'Donoghue. That's the guy. Thank you. He's been the one sort of speaking out about it with his press release recently, sort of speaking out about the plan in its early stages. I don't think we've seen a bill for this yet. I think it is still in the early stages, and it's good to see that some MPs are still thinking clearly and putting an end to this ridiculous idea before it's even off the ground, by sort of releasing it to the public and building the backlash against it. So if we do see any sort of legislation coming out to this extent of permitting protests, I think we'll see a bit of a rise up again in terms of people that are willing to stand against it, because protesting is it's a fundamental right in a democratic society. And
even Chief Wiggum said that.
Yeah. Protesting is a human right. The big issue that that I saw was Daniel Andrews' specific rhetoric in response to the phrase "human rights matter" has been one of the things that we've been saying quite a bit during the anti-lockdown protests, because there has been a complete disregard for human rights in terms of the freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom to protest. And one of the things that Dan said that caught my attention was he said that it's not about human rights, it's about human lives. What he doesn't understand is that lockdowns cost lives too. There have been people that have died from suicide, that have died from preventable
And we
diseases.
want quality of human life
That's right,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, there's a metric going around called, I think it's called life years. So if you take into consideration the expected lifetime of a person being about 83 years in Australia, and if a person dies at 82, you've lost 1 life year. If a person dies at 1, for example, you've lost 82 life years. So you take the life expectancy and then take the amount of life years lost. And if you count that as the metric of saving lives, we've actually lost, I think it's about 10 times as many life years as we've managed to protect with anything resembling a lockdown policy. It's very hard to measure the benefits of lockdown policy because the only control example that we have to compare it with is Sweden, which had
also Florida as well, which has reopened in September.
With Governor DeSantis, he's doing a pretty good job with Florida. He's been, I think, one of the best governors that I've seen in the US in terms of making sure that they don't go overboard with anything to do with the coronavirus. And I think it's just important that you have the restrictions be voluntary. I have no issue with people wearing masks. I have no issue with people choosing to get a vaccine. I have no issue with people choosing to stay at home and self-isolate if they're not sick. I have no issue with private businesses giving people time off for staying at home if that's what they want to do. The issue that I have is using the force of the state to force everybody to do it, because some people value freedom more than they value a modicum of potential safety from a virus. Every day that you walk outside, there is a risk to your life. Every day that you choose to drive in a car, there's a risk to your life. Like, amortized risk to human life is something that is much, much, much more affected by getting into transport than it will ever be affected by your chances of getting a virus with a very high survival rate. And there is no sort of state effort to stop people from driving cars because people get into car accidents. They have, I guess, restrictions on them, whether it be seatbelts or speeding limits. But what they don't do is they say no one can drive any cars, and if you don't like it, you're just a granny killer that wants to run everyone over. No one says that.
Yeah, we can't let anyone to drive until the death toll is 0.
Yeah, exactly. An elimination strategy of car accidents would look like no one being able to drive. Everyone must walk. And if anybody ever gets behind the wheel, they're endangering everyone, especially people that are nowhere near them, because the car could just it could be a super colliding car that just manages to magically hit everyone.
So we've still got the state of emergency in Victoria until at least March 2021, when Dan Andrews got the what's called the one-off COVID extension. He initially wanted a blanket 12-month extension, but that was wound back. Dan has repeatedly said that infinite days without a new community case is not the same as a vaccine. He's been pretty pro-vaccine, that we need some rules and regulations until we get the vaccine. Though given that he reneged from his COVID normal promise after 28 days of no transmission, which was no rules, we're now in.
Get back to. Yeah, no state of emergency. They're moving on with one of the main things that we've been recently arguing against, which we're calling COVID normal. Obviously, Dan tends to use it in a positive light. We consider it a very sort of negative light phrase, which is the sort of permanent reduction in freedom based on whether it be mandatory vaccines, whether it be sort of mandatory masks, all of the little bits and pieces that add up to produce a different living experience for people that shouldn't be there. They should be voluntary choices, and they shouldn't be enforced by law. So that's why we've been protesting against COVID normal since the lockdowns ended, because for us, this fight isn't over. And it's not going to be over until Victoria has its freedom back.
And we've seen in the US and UK, despite the vaccine starting to be rolled out to the most vulnerable, there's still the public health lobby wanting to cancel Christmas. So in regards to Dan's promise that, oh, we can go back to normal once there's a vaccine, you would no way take that to the bank, because the goalposts have always been moved by him that, oh, we'll have to get a certain amount of people to get vaccinated before this. And then with the Pfizer one, we don't even know yet whether it prevents transmission. It just suppresses the symptoms.
Yeah, which says a lot that they've been willing to push this through, because they know that this is not a medical. The vaccine doesn't represent a medical solution for them. For them, I think it represents a political solution, because it is the once and for all thing that they can just throw at any argument that, or you're endangering lives by letting people spread the virus. Once there's a vaccine, they're no longer under the political pressure from their own people to stop putting lives at risk, because that was a lot of the initial political pressure from within the left, was you're putting lives at risk every time you try and make people work or doing any of that stuff. They need a political solution to the lockdown, because from them it's coming organically from their own audience's fear. So it's important that they get it as quickly as they can, because they probably, or at least not all of them, I think a lot of them don't want to do lockdowns. They've been pressured into it. And the vaccine represents a political solution for them, when in reality it'll just be another goalpost to be moved, because after it comes out, it'll be not enough people have it. And then everyone who doesn't get it will be putting lives at risk, just the same as we were putting lives at risk by not wearing masks and not staying within lockdowns and things like that. So we haven't even begun to see the media campaign of fear around the pressure that is going to be put onto people to get the vaccine. There's been sort of initial research done, I think, into 16 different propaganda strategies to try and convince people to get the vaccine in the US. So the government won't be holding back any punches in terms of the rhetoric that they're going to use to compel people to get the vaccine, whether it's enforced by law or enforced by social pressure or enforced by companies. They'll find a way to pressure people, and it's important that people have the determination to be able to maintain their medical freedom, even in the face of substantial obstacles that are going to be put in their way.
I've had another super chat from Andrew McGuinness for $3 Australian, responding to the government departments as corporations. He says, regardless of how governments act, the fact they are corporations, therefore governments are acting in fraud. Do your own research or prove me wrong.
I've definitely done my research. I fully acknowledge that there are government departments that do have ABNs. What I would like to see from this line of argument is a productive solution to what should be done about the government departments having ABN numbers. So even if they have ABN numbers, that could be done as a way of giving them access to having bank accounts for the departments, because oftentimes you'll need an ABN to get a business bank account on behalf of that. At the end of the day, in reality, the government departments still need to be able to interface with the financial system as a business. They need to have cash flow in and out. They need to be able to pay employees. They need to be able to have the ability to trademark things. They need to be able to have all of the financial mechanisms that a corporation would have in order to be able to do the things that they do. So if you want to revoke the ABN of government departments and make it hard for them to get a bank account, then that would be an argument that I'd be more willing to entertain. So instead of it being like the government has got the Victoria Police or Flyers Victoria or whatever it is, has got an ABN, it's a business, it's a fraud. There are a lot more important things that the government is doing wrong than having an ABN number, like enforcing the entire lockdown situation, like the Victoria Police kettling protesters for 4 hours, like pepper spraying people, like locking people in their houses for months and only allowing them to leave with a permission slip piece of paper, for basically turning Victoria into a prison for 6 months. I think the least of our concerns is that a few government departments have ABN numbers, because quite frankly, they're not acting like corporations. Most corporations do voluntary transactions where I can choose not to pay for them. I don't recall getting my Victoria Police bill where I can choose to unsubscribe from getting kettled.
Yeah, there's certainly no opting out of government wherever you are in the world.
No, not until there's significant advancements in private policing. So getting into the more libertarian angle, if there were private police corporations, as a lot of libertarians tend to argue would be another way of doing things, there would be a way for people to hire competing private police companies and sort of push back against laws that that aren't in the interests of the people that are the customers of the police, which is us. The fact that the government acts as a monetary intermediary between the people and the police officers getting paid, that's a big problem. There should be a lot more individual control over how and when the police are used, when in reality, a lot of them spend their time just chasing up revenue related things like trying to get fines, trying to find non-violent offenders, when they should be doing the hard work of actually solving, preventing, and making sure that real crimes that do violate the rights of people, they should be being prevented. They shouldn't be doing all this revenue raising. They should be, in my view, charging more money from their real customers, which are the people of Victoria, to protect their rights, and not acting like revenue gouging parasites and law following apparatchiks that they currently are. I had past tense had a lot of respect for Victoria Police, but they've now shown that their leadership level is non-existent. They are a political instrument now, and that is a very deep shame for the state of Victoria, that we no longer have politically impartial law enforcement, because if the government that takes over next time doesn't like you politically, they'll use the force of the police against you. Today, they're using it against us. If we get into government power, the libertarian anti-lockdown people, if people like Ricardo Bossi from Australia One get into power politically, and there is political power behind libertarianism, behind populism, there'll be nothing stopping us from using the police against political dissidents as well. And to be frank, that's not something that we would ever want to do, but it's something that shouldn't be possible. And the fact that it is a major indictment on Victoria Police, that they have become such a supplicant to the Andrews Labor government.
Well, they've relied on the justification the entire time is just we were following orders, and when the Ring of Steel was taken down, they're like, oh, we're so relieved that it's been removed now that we can get back to our stations. Is that what the officers you've interacted with?
A lot of the officers that I've interacted with have absolutely been very hesitant to take enjoyment from the laws that they're enforcing. I could clearly see on their faces that they were not happy with what they were doing. A lot of them didn't want to be there. Some of them definitely did, but not all of them. At least the ones that I interacted with were fairly reasonable, fairly peaceful. My experience was not universal. A lot of people had very rough police. They had very violent arrests for not doing anything wrong. They had disgraceful headlocking tactics where they'd be taken by teams of 7 port officers headlocked for the crime of standing in front of the Parliament House. So there has been very, very uneven force used on some people in the movement. I myself have not physically been a victim of that force myself, but I know people who have had serious medical injuries from the Victoria Police disastrous lockdown enforcement policies that they've used. So I would consider myself lucky that I haven't been a victim of the police force that some others have been. But that shouldn't be happening in the first place, and there needs to be a top-to-bottom review of the Victoria Police and their attitude towards enforcing lockdown policy. And it's my view that the investigation needs to begin at the top. The culture flows from the top down. The culture of leadership in Victoria Police is one of obedience, even when it's not right to do so. Even when the laws are unjust, they've shown themselves unwilling to conscientiously object from their enforcement. So despite the tendency of most of the officers I worked with to be relatively nice and relatively peaceful, there should have been a bigger pushback from within the Victoria Police towards the enforcement of these laws, and the fact that there wasn't the level of whistleblowing and the level of public scrutiny outlet from the Victoria Police in terms of like police officers resisting the rules, resigning publicly, saying, I'm not going to do this, stepping down, stepping back. We didn't see any of that. So it's got to be a top to bottom review of the leadership of Victoria Police in terms of their willingness to enforce a lot of this in such a biased and excessive way.
Well, it was good to see on the Freedom Day on December the 5th that they stood back and just observed, which showed that, well, the only violence was the only violent encounter that was going to happen was if the police moved in. There were actually 2 Freedom Days. It's a week and a half ago now. There was one on the Saturday and one on the Sunday.
That's a complex situation that I can digest for your viewers a little bit here. So that the reason there were 2 events on the weekend of the 5th and 6th of December was that they were operated by 2 independent teams. So one of those was Freedom Day Australia, and the other one was Melbourne Freedom Rally. So they have similar names. One of them is a Victorian native organising team with an independent Victorian-only leadership decision-making process. The other one is a nationally led sort of conglomerate of different organisers across different states that tends to make decisions at a top-down national level. And there was a bit of a disagreement about the dates between the 2 groups. And there was a little bit of internal debate as to which event should be done in such a way. But the ultimate outcome was that the event run by Melbourne Freedom Rally marched from Fawkner Park to St Kilda Beach, and we were not confronted by the police in any significant way. They sort of watched in an observant role. And the other event on the 6th was very close to CSL Broadmeadows, at a place, if I recall correctly, Jack Roper Reserve or something like that.
Yeah.
Which was, that's right. Yeah, thank you. Which was more of a stationary, music heavy, sort of speaking, group-led organized event. So there was a very different tone. There was a different way of doing things. There's different organizing teams behind them that have a few different points of view on different things. But we're in sort of good contact. There's a lot of solidarity between the 2 teams. There's a few disagreements on small things, but it's nothing major. It's mostly just which one you prefer in terms of which people you like better is a lot of it. Which community you tend to align with. In my sort of perspective, there is a little bit more of a libertarian right leaning to Melbourne Freedom Rally, and there is a little bit more of a libertarian left leaning to some of the other groups that are based in the traditional anti-vaccine activism. A lot of Melbourne Freedom Rally are new people that are relatively populist that haven't been doing anti-vaccine advocacy for very long, that are just fresh into this from the lockdown. So there's just a different culture, and there's a different community. There's a different way of doing things, a different attitude, and there's a difference of platforms as well. Melbourne Freedom Rally is very Telegram native, whereas Freedom Day Australia and a lot of the associated groups are very Facebook native. So there's a little bit of a communication disjointedness there in terms of sort of the weight of the audience for both. But yeah, we get along fine. There's just a difference on a few bits and pieces that aren't that important, and we're happy to work with some of the people that have other events in the future. So 2 events was just a small little leadership misunderstanding, a little bit of a miscoordination at a national level in terms of making sure that people were aware of dates in advance. I won't go into too many details, but nothing major. Just a difference of views and a difference of organizational strategy.
In 2020, I don't care if the freedom advocates are from the traditional right or the traditional left. If you're for freedom and
That's
don't
the
want
way we
a
see it.
totalitarian government putting people under house arrest, I support you.
That's right. We may not agree on everything. In fact, there's even internal debates now occurring as we speak over Australia Day.
Yes, because I know that a lot of the the left-leaning freedom advocates believe it's Invasion Day.
Yeah. So we may not agree on some things. One of those things happens to be the celebration of Australia Day. I personally support the celebration of Australia Day on the 26th of January. I think it's important that we maintain that day as a part of our national heritage, as a part of our history, as a part of our culture, as a country. So I guess if that makes me nationalistic, then so be it. I support Australia as a nation state. I don't support the push for globalism. I think that there is a role to play for international political organizations, but I don't think that that role should supersede the decision-making process of nation states because of that's too much centralization of power causes bad outcomes, and the nation state, at least on a planetary level, is a fundamental decentralizing process of decision making. So if you don't like the government of one country, you can move to a different country as a resort. But if there is one government, then it becomes very difficult to move away from it. So the nation state is first and foremost a protection of local decentralized decision making. And secondly, it's a vehicle upon which we build a framework of a national identity that I think Australia Day is an important part of, whether it's a complex issue surrounding the history of our relationship as Caucasian Australians with Aboriginal Australians. That's a discussion to be had. But I think that the date on the 26th of January is something that shouldn't be changed. I don't support changing the date. Some people do support changing the date, and that's fine. I'm willing to hear compelling arguments for that. But I don't at this time support changing the date. I think that there's enough sort of historical weight to the 26th of January and the First Fleet to justify Australian a celebration of Australia Day on the 26th of January. So that's another thing that we maybe disagree with in some ways. So we'll see the outcome of that in the weeks to follow as we get closer to Australia Day. But from my perspective, I support celebrating it. I support the nation state of Australia. I don't support everything its government does. I definitely don't support everything the Victorian government does. But overall, I would rather have a nation state as a decentralized decision-making process than a one world government. And if imagine like there's sort of two choices: either the decisions are made internationally and you get no say in it, or the decisions are made here in Australia and you have the ability to vote out the politician that made it. I know which one I would choose. I think we have a super for opposed to totalitarian government. But what about totalitarian corporations? So that's a good point raised by Suad01. So opposition to totalitarian corporations is also very important. And the way you do that is through consumer sovereignty. So every time you do business with a company, you are in fact empowering that company to keep doing whatever it is that it is doing. So the best way to mitigate the effect of totalitarian corporations is with entrepreneurial competition. If you try to make overly restrictive anti-monopoly legislation or go straight for the antitrust hammer, you tend to get some bad side effects of they just change the name, they split up into 100 different companies and then do largely the same thing. What you should aim to change is not the activities of a free market participant in a state interference sense, but in the free market change of incentives to move towards better corporate behavior that will allow them to make more money by preserving the freedom of their customers. Turns out that companies don't make much money when their people are sort of restricted in too many ways. There are some companies that do make money, specifically large tech companies, internet retailers. Everybody that benefits from lockdowns has an incentive to continue those lockdowns. So it's important to realize the coalescence of aligned incentives that led to lockdowns being as severe and prolonged as they were. There was a lot of money being made. There is still a lot of money being made from pushing lockdowns. And there is a lot of money still remaining to be made from the distribution of a vaccine. That could be in the tunes of billions of dollars for whichever company manages to force governments to give people their vaccine. There is a big sort of pot of money waiting for whichever company is able to force the government to use their vaccines. And that big pot of money is a giant incentive to be a totalitarian corporation. So if we as consumers resist the introduction of mandatory vaccines, if we resist the introduction of business surveillance, and if we resist the forced compliance with these measures at a consumer level, it becomes very unprofitable very quickly to enforce these things that you would ascribe to a totalitarian corporation.
Just going back to you're talking about Australia Day, the lefty freedom advocates, I don't think they favour globalism or global socialism. I would say that they would be more for communitarianism and anarcho-syndicalism type governments. But definitely the Invasion Day leadership are full socialist globalists.
I would not be surprised. We've seen this sort of issue happen in the United States, particularly with, if I recall correctly, I think it's Thanksgiving and Juneteenth. Hang on. So Juneteenth, what was the day that was close to Juneteenth again that they have an issue in? Is it like Independence Day, or like there's a big debate over Juneteenth being close to another day? I can't remember which day that was.
Yeah, July the 4th.
That's right. The 4th of July, Independence Day. Yeah, I was right the second time. So the Independence Day debate versus Juneteenth. What you tend to have is a very maligned sort of cultural attack on a country by attacking its national day, because when you sort of break it down into its component parts, a country is mostly an idea that exists in people's heads. So to attack a country under the sort of doctrine of unrestricted warfare that's proposed by the Chinese Communist Party, leftists tend to attack ideas by using what's called deconstruction, or there's a cultural Marxist tendency to attack ideas by ascribing them to negative emotional traits. So if you can call the country's national day racist, you're able to effectively attack the idea of Australia or the idea of America in the minds of people by attaching it to a stigma and using postmodernist sort of methods of argument and critical race theory as components to this mechanism. You attack the idea of a country, and you're therefore able to attack the fabric that unites it together and make it more easy to politically overcome and to militarily overcome it as well, because you attack the idea that unites the people together.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. I'll finish off by there's another round of Melbourne Freedom Rallies this weekend, and
so those are different. The ones that are going to be every Saturday are more so park gatherings. So there's a little bit of a story to those as well. When Melbourne Freedom Rally has large events, we tend to advertise those with a specific banner for those. Whereas when there's essentially like an off week, because we found sort of over the course of our efforts that a protest can't really be done in a large way more than about once a month before you run into energy loss, burning people out. So we found that about once a month is the sweet spot. So in the off weeks when we don't have a protest, we have park gatherings at a variety of different local parks. So that's a place for people who are new to the movement to join in a completely informal sense, to just rock up and just start talking about freedom, to start talking about what we're getting into with Melbourne Freedom Rally, to just get to know the community. It's for the community to hang out, catch up with each other, talk about strategies that we've realized for dealing with the police, and most importantly, to rebuild the bonds of localism that have been lost through the last sort of 5 or 10 years of globalism and digitization. There's been an abstraction of social relationships into the internet. And while I think that that has had largely positive consequences, it's also had a lot of negative consequences, because I guess in the past, before any of this, people would have friends nearby their town. They would get to know their neighbors. They'd get to know their friends, whether they'd go to a religious place. That I essentially see religion as a bootstrapping vector for localized meeting of people. That's what the most important thing religion did in the past, was unite people and create a cultural, moral fabric. With the digitization of social relationships through the internet, we've seen a loss of the ability for people to get to know the people around them. So that's what we're kind of trying to return to, is having local meetups that are like close to you, so you can rebuild some of the social connections that you might have lost through the lockdowns, to meet new friends, to hang out with the people that are in the movement. I've met some fantastic people through this that have become very good friends. And it's important that people who do love freedom, such as myself, get to know the other people who do, because we're not as common as we would like to be, unfortunately. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily see it as the thing that they want to spend their time doing. So the people that do want to spend their time and energy advocating for freedom, fighting for freedom, it's important that we get to know each other, because in any network effect, it grows in value with the number of people squared. And that's a good way for people to sort of build numbers up, so that if we have 1,000 for this rally, we might have 2,000 for the next one, or 3,000 for the one after that. And the 23rd of October, that was kind of the highest one yet, where we had about 3,000 to 4,000. That was the one where we had all the stars aligning. We had a good location that had a good Lindy effect. People knew the shrine. People could get there very easily. There wasn't a lot of blocking people off. But that was the stars aligning for a big event. That one was. So the way we're going to be building numbers going forward is having a protest on a semi-regular basis. But it's important that we have several weeks of build-up, of promotion, of finding new people that are aligned with us. And the way we do that is through our park gatherings. So they're not necessarily all facilitated areas. Sometimes for some of the areas, people have got to sort of cluster on their own. At least that's the way we did it at the start. We had to find our own way around it. So for some of the people that go to the smaller ones, they may not have the same experience. But for the larger ones, we're able to meet up in a group and have a pretty good time, have like lunches afterwards, and just catch up with friends at this point.
And I'll share the link tree for the Melbourne Freedom Rally, which it's become quite a popular for a lot of new organizations in 2020 to just have that link tree with all the different social media there. So obviously you mentioned Telegram has been instrumental in the creation of Melbourne Freedom Rally. I think I don't know if anyone's coined this phrase before, but Melbourne Freedom Rally is one of the first Telegram native political movements to emerge in Australia, where it's essentially our base platform is Telegram. We didn't start on Facebook. We didn't start on Twitter. We didn't start on Instagram. We live and breathe Telegram because it's got very strong freedom of speech protections. It's got a very, very powerful feature set. It's got the combination of channels and public groups, and it allows many-to-many communication on a scale that is not replicated in any other social network, in my view. It's a very powerful platform that I think will continue to grow. And I think Durov, the creator of Telegram, has done a fantastic job in keeping it this politically neutral. It has very, very strong freedom of speech protections. There's none of this
groups getting banned over silly things. There's no
The only
there's
issue is Apple, the app,
the
blocks
applications.
stuff itself.
Yeah, so there's not a whole lot you can do when the two app store giants come after you. There's I guess there's the 30% Apple tax first and foremost, which I think is being lowered to 15% for small apps in the future. But there's the first bite of the apple in the Apple tax, and the second bite of the apple is the Apple censorship, because obviously Apple as a company may not want to be optically close to some of the things that are on Telegram that I have personally witnessed. So when you have a very free speech environment, it's important that there's let's just say an active moderation team to take on that role for the community on the community's behalf. And I think we've seen with Telegram the ability for communities to moderate themselves much more effectively than the Silicon Valley tech giants would like to have people believe. Communities moderating themselves is, I think, the future. I don't think it's the role of a company in Silicon Valley in the United States to be dictating to everyone around the world what freedom of speech includes and doesn't include, especially when they're doing so from an advertiser-first driven model. When they're coming from a
disclaimers under every post with Joe Biden is the projected winner of the election, according to official sources.
Yeah, officials. What they often do is they'll just link to a friendly mainstream media article. So at this point, I'm not sure who's doing
independent fact checking.
Independent fact checkers. Independent fact checkers, Snopes, which is apparently run by about 3 people. And a lot of what fact checkers do is they often try to just take a single mainstream media article and say XYZ authority says this is untrue, and therefore this is debunked. When you hear the word debunked, always make sure that you look into what they mean by debunked, because oftentimes when they say the word debunked, they mean they've found one little tidbit wrong with the body of information presented by a source. They've found one little rebuttal argument to make, and they call the whole thing debunked. So make sure that you don't just believe the labels on face value, that you look into what they actually say. Are they just citing the New York Times, and the New York Times says this is debunked? So therefore, by the god of the mainstream media, it is therefore deemed in the canon of the establishment narrative to be untrue. You need to be able to distinguish the difference between the establishment canon narrative and the reality that can be backed up with evidence, peer-reviewed papers, with observational evidence, with video evidence, with text evidence, with historical records. And also another sort of thing that you need to take into consideration is the what I like to call the wikigenesis theory of fact fabrication. So I'll unpack that for a moment. Wikigenesis theory of fact fabrication is when a mainstream media article makes a spurious claim that is not fully backed by evidence, and then that claim is then used to update a Wikipedia article, and then the Wikipedia article is used to make another media article, and then you have and then that media article points to the first media article as the citation from Wikipedia. And essentially, if you can inject something into Wikipedia and get that to be used as a source, you can essentially create a fact web of interlocking mainstream media articles to make it very difficult to assert that the truth is what it is, because Wikipedia says that it's not, because a mainstream media article says that it's not. And you can make complete fabrications that get put into the canon body of Wikipedia, and it's very difficult to disprove some of them. So yeah, there's a big issue around Wikipedia pages not being able to be edited to remove things that have been disproven, to remove the editorialized suffixes that are added onto people's names for political reasons, to remove the slur style of language that's used for some people, specifically on the political right when they leave the mainstream narrative. But yeah, it's important to recognize that social media as it exists today depends on other people to do a lot of its moderation work. They use independent contractors. They use third-party organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, like the Anti-Defamation League, as essentially the ground truth of what is and is not hate speech, what is and is not allowed to be said. And it's important that people look into the financial and political motivations of everything claiming to be an independent fact checker, a watch list organization, and things like that, because they are used for political reasons in a lot of cases.
And you're still on the traditional outlets, Twitter, Facebook, Discord server, and you're also on Gab, which is another good free speech social media network, but is banned from all the app stores.
It's unfortunately been taken from some of the app stores. I think it still works on some apps. I've got it on my phone, so it can't be too banned. They were banned. I'm pretty sure they found a way to get back in. I'll have to confirm that it still works, because sometimes they'll ban an app and it'll be on your phone still, but it hasn't worked. But the desktop client still works fine. So the good thing about Gab is it's very all the code base is open source. It's run by a very pro freedom of speech founder named Andrew Torba. He's a great guy, fantastic guy. I'd recommend people look into Gab and Andrew Torba if they have time. But that social network has been going for quite a few years with a very pro freedom of speech stance. They have been they are the poster child victim of financial censorship. They have been taken off a lot of credit card platforms. They've been removed from their hosting servers.
They've persevered at every obstacle.
Absolutely persevered. They're a profile in courage in terms of being able to resist the authoritarian urges of Silicon Valley large tech companies, and they are to be commended. They are one of the only companies that takes Bitcoin for their membership payments. So the reason they do that is because Bitcoin can't be financially censored in the same way that a fiat currency can. So I think people moving to freedom of speech social networks, freedom of speech enhancing currencies such as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, anything in a public blockchain sense that allows people to move to a decentralized model of trust, a decentralized model of human coordination, and a decentralized model of monetary and informational exchange. Those are the building blocks of a freedom-preserving future. If we depend on centralized corporations for our payments, if we depend on centralized corporations for our social media interchange, then our ideas and our money are fundamentally filtered without even us being fully aware of it. Because when something is filtered from you, you aren't aware that you don't know something. You create a massive social tendency towards people having unknown unknowns for malicious reasons, whether it's the censorship of the Joe Biden story and Hunter Biden story, where allegedly some large percentage of Democratic voters, I think it was about 40%, were not aware that Hunter Biden's corruption issues had occurred, that there were Hunter Biden emails, Hunter Biden leaked files that indicated that he's in a high degree of corruption with the Chinese Communist Party, that he's heavily compromised with explicit pictures that anyone can find on the internet. That story was kept from the American electorate deliberately, and there is a significant element of the American voting base that would have changed their mind if they had have known that. So what we've seen with the suppression of the Hunter Biden story is the largest documented example of coordinated censorship that has had politically damaging outcomes in the United States. And unless we do something about it to decentralize information, to preserve censorship resistance, whether it's through blockchain social networks, whether it's through other decentralized communication platforms, or for the time being just in Telegram and Gab with freedom of speech preserving centralized platforms, that's the way that we can move forward to sort of get people off of YouTube and onto Rumble or onto Library or onto BitChute, onto Library, BitChute, Rumble.
We're also on DLive
Excellent.
as well.
DLive is better. DLive is better. They used to be decentralized, but unfortunately their live streaming component is centralized. and they stopped using the Steem blockchain and instead moved to a different blockchain. And then they were acquired by Justin Sun and the team at Tron, so they're not as decentralized as they used to be. Again, better than nothing, but there's a lot of market incentives for people and creators to move to new and emerging platforms, whether it be Gab, whether it be Parler. If there's anything that the ordinary average person can do to improve the condition of freedom in the world, it's to disempower centralized establishment preserving media and social networks and move to a decentralized model where trust comes from the bottom up instead of the top down.
Exactly. And how can people follow you on social media?
So you can reach me on Twitter or Gab at HasMcLean.
Do you have your own
can
link
also
tree?
find me. I need to make my own link tree. That's a great idea. I might do that next. But I'm also on Telegram with it should be at HasMcLean channel. That's a much more freedom of speech preserving link to share. So Telegram is at HasMcLean channel, where I sort of make channel announcements there, where you can see some of the things that I've put there so far. And yes, the main one that I use is Twitter and Telegram. I don't use Facebook that much. I find the content to be about 5 years stale by the time it reaches you on Facebook. And it's not as good of a user experience as some other platforms. My favorite is definitely Telegram by far. So definitely reach me there.
Oh, well, I've appreciated chatting with you tonight to learn a bit more of an insight into how the Melbourne Freedom Rally movement blossomed and is still going. And good luck contesting those 7 fines, because that'll be quite the feat. When have you got a summons yet? Because I assume that you've challenged them all.
I've challenged them all. I haven't got my summons yet. That's coming soon. I tried to wait as long as possible before putting them in for appeal. I tried to do a review on some of them first. The review didn't.
Yeah, all the reviews
the
just
review
got knocked back.
That sounds like a suggestion box. It's like, yep, just take a ticket, and we'll talk to you when we feel like it. But yeah, I've put them all in for a court date now. I've got 2 ones that are in a later stage, so I'll need to do a few extra things to deal with those 2. But the majority of them are now on for court dates, and I'll be appealing them all in court, and I'll be asserting to the judge that the right to freedom of movement in Australia is protected by federal statute and cannot be violated under the guise of a state of emergency with the Chief Health Officer's directives, and that those directives are in fact unlawful. That the Public Health and Wellbeing Act actually violates certain elements of the Biosecurity Act. There's a lot of
I have heard this argument before. I have my doubts whether you'll be successful, but it's all like contributing to clogging up the system.
At the very least, it'll be good to have it in court instead of just paying the money and letting this go away. I'm going to be taking them to a legal contest as to the validity of these laws, and the bigger issue is if I am unsuccessful, then it means that everything that the Andrews government did in terms of this lockdown is completely legal. And that's a death knell for freedom of movement and constitutional human rights in the state of Victoria and in Australia at large. So if I'm unsuccessful, consider me to be a canary in the coal mine of you are not allowed to leave your house, and that will be enforced at a court level. It's not just police overreach, it's court corruption, it's constitutional insufficiency, and it is a legal issue that needs to be remedied with policy immediately.
Well, if the courts are reopened in 2021, I feel I'll be spending a lot of time in and outside of court covering all of these various, because there's
Oh
still
yeah,
the
they're gonna be very
it's-
interesting.
incitement
Oh,
trials.
the inside ones, those
Yeah,
are the worst. That
yeah,
was the worst overreach. Whether it be Thanos or Anthony Califf or some of the others that had incitement sort of charges brought against them.
and it hasn't deterred any of them from activism.
No, they've. I think some of them have been given bail conditions, but they're still on side. Maybe
Yeah.
not in a boots in the ground sense, but they're still
Well,
absolutely on side.
Thanos, he spoke at the Sydney Freedom
He
Rally
did,
because there's nothing in his bail conditions that says he can't go to the
Can't
Sydney
go to Sydney.
CBD.
Yeah. It's a good loophole there to just go to another state and speak because from what I've heard, the New South Wales police force not only contain more whistleblowers than the Victoria police force. There were the people that wrote the Cops for COVID Truth letter. I believe they were from New South Wales, but they also seem to have had a much more reasonable approach to enforcing the reduced lockdown restrictions. I don't think New South Wales had anything resembling a 5-kilometre travel limit or even a 25-kilometre travel limit. I'm pretty sure they stayed within the goalposts of reasonable social distancing and isolation. I don't think they had any of that, if I'm correct.
Well, they never had a second lockdown.
They never had a second lockdown. Yeah. So there was a lot less public trust for them to lose. But unfortunately, Victoria Police have chosen to lose public trust in spades over this.
It's been the ultimate tragedy in Victoria in 2020. Well, take care. Have a good Christmas, and I'm sure I'll run into you in the new year.
Yeah, definitely. Merry Christmas to you, Tim. Thanks for having me on, and to all the viewers of Wilmsfront, like and subscribe, and make sure to tell your friends about Wilmsfront, the podcast, and make sure to let people know that the fight is not over yet. That we will not accept COVID normal. And that we'll continue pushing back against the encroachments on our freedom until we have all of the restrictions lifted and the 5 demands of Melbourne Freedom Rally are in fact met in full.
The old normal plus some more freedoms, that'd be the ultimate outcome.
That would be fantastic. If we can galvanize a generation of people against the overreach of the state to generate more libertarians and ultimately create a voting block of libertarians that can start making political requests of consequence, that would be the ultimate outcome, that we can pivot to a long-term strategy of reducing the size, scope, and ferocity of the state, of reforming monetary policy to be more decentralized and more aligned with sound monetary policy. And we can move to a freedom of speech preserving legal system and a liberty preserving legal system where things like this, like lockdowns, like state of emergency, state of disaster, are not legally allowed to ever be done again.
Amen. That's what we're all hoping. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. I'll see you later.
All right. That concludes tonight's Wilmsfront. Now, I know that I promoted James Goddard, the UK British patriot activist. Again, tonight I was supposed to be on last week's show, but he was unable to make it tonight either. So maybe a Wilmsfront show in the new year. There'll be one more Wilmsfront show happening next Wednesday. That'll be a pub episode where I'll be sitting with my producer, Margot Huss, and we'll be reviewing the year of Wilmsfront, the highlights, some of the people that we met, and the journey throughout the year. Tomorrow night will be the last episode ever of the Uncockables. To find out why, you'll have to tune in tomorrow night, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time, on the Uncockables YouTube and DLive. And then on Friday, the last episode of 2020 for Trad Tasman Talk with myself and Dewey De Boer, 6 p.m. Melbourne time on the Unshackled YouTube channel. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. I'll see you tomorrow night, and I'll see you next week for the final Wilms Front of 2020.
Thanks for tuning in to Wilms Front. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV. Thanks for tuning in to Wilms Front. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting theunshackled.net to view all our shows and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.